Welcome back to the Stratcom podcast. We're joined today by Nicholas Fang. Nicholas has over 2 decades of experience in the media and communications industry. He also currently serves as the Director for Security and Global Affairs at the Singapore Institute of International Affairs. And he also chairs the Strategic Communications Expert Panel at the Singaporean Ministry of Defense. Nicholas, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us. Great to be here in Riga and looking forward to having a good chat.
Absolutely. So perhaps we can start with a broad scene setter. Considering your involvement with Stratcom at the Singaporean MOD, could you perhaps sketch the disinformation landscape in your country and in the wider Southeast Asia region?
So I think it's interesting that we are here in Riga. And as we know, we have quite a large contingent from Singapore. And some people have been asking, why do you come all the way here with so many people? You're obviously not in NATO and Europe is a long way away from Asia. I think we, as a general philosophy in Singapore, we like to be ahead of the curve, if possible, when it comes to threats. I think if you wait for the problem to come to your doorstep and then try to decide what's happening, it's probably too late. And in that context, I would say that countries in Asia and Southeast Asia potentially don't face as clear and present a danger as countries in the West, in Europe, in the US. Many countries of which have already faced significant threats within their society from disinformation or what is commonly known as fake news. It's still a relatively new phenomenon for us in Asia and in Southeast Asia. But I don't think we want to wait until it becomes a regular threat for us before we try to figure out what we're doing. So I would say, as with most cases, we see a lot of disinformation in and around the political environment. When you have major events like elections, especially, we see that. And in the past 3-4 years, of course, COVID disinformation has been rampant. We started to get into the picture in 2018, 2019. And in those days, we saw a lot of political focused type of disinformation. The reason why we got into the fact-checking game was because we started to see many outlets proliferating absolutely ridiculous, types of political disinformation with very little consequence. And because of technology, people were sharing and spreading this at an incredibly fast rate. So we felt that as a good corporate citizen, if we see something, we should say something to try to contribute to a solution. Again, in the past few years, that evolved into COVID disinformation. We have, COVID vaccine, COVID deniers. We have vaccine skeptics, anti-vaxxers as well. But we try to look at everything that represents a threat at the national level to society, whether it's in terms of policy, safety, security, and health. But definitely not at the level that we're seeing in other parts of the world. And I think that's true for Singapore and to a certain degree for other countries in Southeast Asia and broader Asia. Of course, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, but the threat of a major power like China, which is happy to use disinformation as a tool, is present for all of us as well.
So in terms of preparedness for these threats, Singapore does seem to be very proactive in its approach. In fact, it's, I believe, one of the only countries in the world with an anti-fake news law. Could you tell our listeners, has it proven effective? Has it found an optimal balance in your view? Does it still have any critics or opposition domestically?
Maybe I'll start with your last question first. Definitely, there are critics. There was a lot of concern that the government would use something as heavy as legislation to suppress free speech or political opponents. But I think the Singapore government has adopted a very light touch approach. It has deployed the law on a few occasions, but largely to incidents where there is blatant, disinformation or misinformation around government policy that would affect people at the social and national levels.
Could you give an example of this?
I think if people, pointed to, say, labor law and said that, the Singapore government favors foreigners over locals, for example, that is something the government would deploy. The law is called POFMA, it's Prevention of Online Falsehoods and Manipulation. They would put it into effect in those cases. But what has really been heartening for me is to see that they don't always issue takedown notice. They are happy to leave examples of disinformation there, but request platforms to put in place a correction notice. So people can still see the original claim and they can contrast that with the correction, so that we come with a more educated population at some point that is able to understand, the disinformation or misinformation, and also to understand the truth. If you just impose takedowns, it looks very draconian, and you don't have that educative effect as well. So I think seeing the law, of course, can have a chilling effect in different countries around the world. But for us, as private sector fact-checking organizations, I think our approach is that you need a full spectrum of solutions or tools, because the threat is very, very much across a lot of different areas. It's a social level, it's on digital, there's people-to-people interactions. So you do need, as an effective solution, as many levers as possible, and legislation is one of them.
You mentioned the role of platforms. In your view, do these big tech platforms do a satisfactory job of moderating or removing illegal or harmful content in Singapore? And where does your company step in if these platforms fail to do their job?
Well, I think as we've seen in other parts of the world, the big tech companies say the right things. They declare the intention to prevent disinformation, to prevent online harms. They look for, CIB, coordinated inauthentic behaviors, and they try to tackle blatant examples of disinformation, state or non-state. I think people say the right things, but the challenge is always that the algorithms or the business models for a lot of these platforms run sort of counter to the declared aim of trying to reduce and slow down the spread of disinformation. Big tech and social platforms, they want to increase the number of people using it. They want to create stickiness. Mm-hmm. They've done their psychoanalysis, and they realize that if people hear things that they feel they agree with, they are more likely to stay engaged. If they are in a silo or in a community where people share all the same views, then they are more comfortable and become more entrenched in those spaces, rather than trying to consume a broad range of information and trying to understand a broader picture. So with that kind of very, very superficial analysis of social media objectives, it's not easy to see why they would actively seek to moderate content, to seek to monitor, to control, because that goes against, for example, Facebook, that goes against their declared intent, which is to allow the community to run the platform. They just provide the platform for people to exist. And of course, when you have advertising and commercial interests, it's hard to see that they would be the strongest actor to fight against disinformation or fake news on their platforms. So that's where it dovetails nicely into the first part of your question, is what do we see fact-checking and private sector fact-checking playing in terms of its role in society. And I think having a little bit of independence from government and from big tech allows us to objectively present information that we feel will be useful when people come to try to decide whether something is true or false. It's not something that we've spoken to some people already at the conference, and they've asked, is it commercially viable? Do you have big corporate clients that engage you? The answer is not yet, because I think the sort of fake news concerns haven't spread very deeply into the corporate sector, so nobody really wants to pay for fact checking.
So what kind of clients do you have?
So we actually are a market and social research agency. So we do commercial research. We do online surveys. We do focus group discussions. We do research branding analysis for our clients. And that sort of pays the bills. And I'm very grateful that we have, staff here who are very passionate and engaged when it comes to fact checking. And that sort of covers our costs. And we offer that as a public good for now. We do projects that are more education focused. So we work with schools, educational institutions to try to increase the awareness of the threat, and also understanding of how to handle disinformation or fake news among the general public or students and young people especially. And those generate some income. But, in the same way that we wouldn't necessarily take money from the government, because that obviously compromises objectivity. If I took money from a McDonald's, then the Burger King will get upset and say, "Oh, you'll never fact check any fake news spread by McDonald's, right? Because they're paying your bills." So I think we're trying to be quite careful and circumspect when it comes to that. But at the same time, we are also monitoring to see whether at some point, the private sector in general and commercial interests will spread to say we want to hire fact checking as a service.
Let's kind of tackle the core of the issue, fact checking and its role and relevance as such. I think all of our viewers, of course, know what fact checking is, but there does seem to be a quite spirited, somewhat even controversial debate regarding the role of fact checking and its actual effectiveness in countering disinformation, for instance. So there is credible research suggesting that once a person has been kind of exposed to disinformation, it's actually very difficult to get them to change their mind afterwards, even if you present them with the correct facts, even if you kind of reactively fact check and tell them, oh, the information you saw before, that's fake news, that was manipulated, it's inauthentic, so on. So what is, in your view, the role of fact checking as part of this wider toolkit in our fight against disinformation? Is fact checking, do you agree with criticism that it can be too slow or too reactive, or what is your view?
Wow, there's a lot of good questions raised within what you just shared, and I think that first and foremost, I would say again that you need a full spectrum of solutions and tools and levers to tackle a full spectrum threat like fake news, like disinformation. There is a role for the government to play in terms of sharing information and data in a transparent and hopefully timely fashion. There's a role for the traditional media to play in terms of reporting some of this information or analyzing or breaking it down in a way that the general audience can appreciate. And there will be and has to be a role for fact checkers to play within society as well.
Okay.
And I'll give you an example of why that's so. I think if a government says something, there will be, and in Singapore, there's still a very high level of trust in the government, but there will be people in the population who are skeptical, who say that, right, the government says certain things for its own agenda, for its own objectives. Some will dismiss it out of hand, and some will look at it more skeptically. When the media reports certain things, and I think that we can see, around the world, even in countries that declare a free press, it's hard for any organization to then say we are completely independent and objective. The owners, the people who run media platforms usually have some kind of bias in some direction, and you see that in the way the reporting is shaped. So it's hard to say that, wow, I can point to one definitive source and say that these guys are the people who provide truth in all situations. So I think having more voices, I hope people will look at us as fact checkers and say, right, they don't really have that much of an agenda. They're not really trying to earn a lot of money from this. Mm-hmm. They are not supporting any particular political party or organization, for example, and consume news from us. And we don't want to be the only source of truth. Mm-hmm. We want to be one of the sources, and we want people to have a buffet of credible, sources of information to make the important decisions in their lives. I know that the BBC recently announced that they are launching their Verify project, which is meant to be fact-checking as well. And they are leveraging on the fact that they still have a certain brand of being credible as a news source and, sort of reaching out to people and providing information in that sense. But, media can become contested. It can become politicized and polarized as well. So we should have more sources as well. Related to that, my fear then is that at some point, fact-checking, if it becomes widespread and widely consumed, becomes contested, becomes weaponized as well. Is my fact-checking better than your fact-checking? Is your fact-check going to fact-check my fact-checks? And we could end up into a situation that we see with the media now, right? Where whose voice shouts the loudest, or, does Donald Trump start his own sort of, social media platform? Alternative facts as well. Yeah. So, but for now, I think having as many diverse sources and building out this, one of our declared aims is to build a culture of emotional skepticism where every individual can be their own fact checker. The last thing we want is for us to become a black box solution where people will type in a question and we spit out an answer, true or false, because that can be weaponized so easily, and people will then we might start to see a polarization among fact-checking as well. So we want to teach people, if you see our fact-checks, they're pretty long. We take you through every step. We base our research and our analysis on open source information. Mm-hmm. We use very, very sophisticated tools like Google search and online. I'm joking, of course. These are stuff that everybody can use. And if you have 5 or 10 minutes in your day and you wanted to verify something, we take you through the steps of how to do that. So I think that's our aim, to sort of educate, build awareness, but also teach people that in a very simple ways, you can do your own fact-checking. Mm-hmm. You don't have to rely, on all these other platforms.
So NATO, of course, is a political and military alliance. So I would also like to take the opportunity to ask you a couple questions that relate to the same threats, but more place them in a geopolitical context. Here in the Baltics, we, of course, are very familiar with Russian foreign information manipulation and different forms of foreign interference in democratic processes and so on. In Singapore, as you said, China is a more active player. Could you maybe tell us what instruments or what proxies China can use to target Singaporean society? Or are there other threat dimensions that our listeners should know about?
Sure. I think that's a really interesting question and a very interesting area that we spend a lot of time looking at. I would say at the start first that we do not, of course, dismiss the Russia threat, because in Southeast Asia, Singapore was the only country to impose sanctions on Russia. They were fairly limited in nature, but
and in response to
the invasion of Ukraine, yes, and it did not go down well with the Russian ambassador in Singapore, of course. So we are not going to say that we would never be exposed to threats from around the world. Singapore has a particular position as a very open economy. We depend a lot on trade, so we're not naive enough to say that nobody's going to target us at any point in time. That being said, the proximity geographically to China, of course, means that we are more attuned to the threat. And when we look at China's, strategy and tactics over time, I think disinformation and information operations is fast becoming a very useful tool. But they have traditionally used, again, a broad spectrum of tools, of levers. It pertains to people-to-people interaction. From time to time, we've had experience where they're unhappy with something that Singapore has said or done, and they apply pressure on the government through cultural centers, through educational institutions, through the business community as well. So that kind of full spectrum threat means that people need to become very attuned to the possibility of the danger that's posed. Singapore as a multiracial society, we're 75% ethnic Chinese. So a lot of people have family ties to China, business ties in China. People still speak.
Of course, the language bond.
Language, right, as well. So it is tricky. And I think that a question was raised recently about why there still seems to persist among some segments of our population a certain openness to the narrative that it was NATO expansionism, for example, that triggered Russia to invade Ukraine, that Russia is, not the bad guy. And we realized that some of this came from the China narrative. And China, of course, pushes some of those positions. And through the effects of their influence and info operations, there are populations within Southeast Asia and Singapore who seem to believe that, or at least be open to that kind of narrative. So I think it's definitely something we're a bit more attuned to. But the fact that, as we were saying, we have a big contingent and delegation here in Riga, I think we want to be aware and knowledgeable about all potential threats around the world. Influence and information operations, they don't respect borders, right? They flow through cyber digital platforms to anywhere in the world instantaneously. So it's a real threat.
And do you see Russia and China learning from each other, or perhaps kind of echoing, parroting each other's narratives, or do they operate using different means?
I think definitely there is some sort of supporting fire from both sides. As I said, China does tend to spread a little bit of the Russian position that seeks to justify the invasion of Ukraine. But tactics-wise, I think they're quite different. I would say, Russian tactics so far have been quite blunt and quite maybe lacking in the finesse that the Chinese operations tend to have. If you look at the deep fakes, for example, we saw a deepfake video of President Zelensky as saying something that obviously he didn't, but then his head was out of proportion in size to his body, and you could see that there was a certain pixelization around his neck. So that at some point was traced back to Russia, and we're like, not the most sophisticated. China, on the other hand, as we've said, are very, very sophisticated. They would use social, cultural, business, education ties to effect some of their spread of information or disinformation, and of course then cyber and digital tools as well. But we do recognize that it's not restricted to these two actors alone, but anyone who's looking at the disinformation space would seek to learn best practices in that sense from other people who use this information. And again, it's fantastic again to see NATO doing the Riga conference so that everybody becomes sort of updated and aware of all the latest tactics. Everybody's talking about AI and stuff like that nowadays. So to stay ahead of the threat, I think this is very important.
Yeah, it's very important for partners to meet and talk it out, exchange notes. What do you think NATO can learn from Singapore's experience in building resilience? For instance, is there something special about your education curriculum, or are there programs or measures you take to raise the kind of media literacy or AI literacy of the average Singaporean citizen?
I think definitely Singapore tries to do a lot. We have numerous programs that run throughout society. We recognize that societies are very, very diverse. So a young digital native, you see kids 3-4 years old, they already start to do this action because they know how to swipe, and they spend all their time swiping on smart devices. It's very different how you would approach them as you would an elderly person who maybe just started using Facebook. For example, My mom is pretty active on Facebook, and she's asking me, I saw this, I saw that, and how do we know that's true? So
have you taught your mom adequately to kind of identify, look out for disinformation?
I think we definitely have a lot of conversations about that, and I always refer her to the Black Dot Research website to look at stuff that we've debunked. So it's great because their generation is more attuned to the fact that there is a threat, and it's just learning the skills to counter that threat. Our National Library Board, for example, runs a program called SURE, S-U-R-E, that sort of encourages people to stop, to try to understand, to do some research, and then not necessarily to share things so quickly to sort of slow down the spread of disinformation. And I know our education ministry is looking at how to inject more of this type of syllabus into the curriculum so that young people from an early age are very attuned to this, and we're doing some courses with some schools to do our part in education as well. But I would say that Singapore, if there was anything to learn from, would be the fact that we try to make sure we're ahead of the curve. This threat is evolving not on a monthly, weekly basis. It's changing and evolving, by the minute. So if you're not up to date, if you're not understanding the evolution of the threat, there's no way you're going to get ahead of it. Singapore tries to do that. At the same time, we try to have a convening power where we bring together people from the region so we can share best practices as well. We at Black Dot Research mirror that. We've set up an Asian fact-checking network to bring together fact-checkers from around the region to help with capability development. We're doing a conference later this year as well. But I think, we wouldn't go so far as to say that we have anything to teach NATO. NATO is obviously very advanced with the Stratcom Center of Excellence, with conferences like what we're seeing in Riga. And the environment and societies that we're seeing in Europe and in NATO are so diverse that I think everybody has to develop their own approach of countering this information. But it's great that we have this chance, as you said, to have exchange and to learn best practices from each other.
Maybe one final concluding question with an eye toward the future, considering that your company does do some really innovative work in mapping trends regarding disinformation and so on. How do you see the relationship between AI and development of AI and disinformation? What are some maybe dark trends that keep you up at night?
Yeah, I think everybody's talking about AI in the marketplace space that we're having here at the dialogue. We're one guy from Asia with our fact checking operations, and every other sort of booth is an AI company. And in Singapore, we're starting to look at the possibility of AI, of large learning machines, of ChatGPT in combating disinformation. I think it's still very early because, as we know, in terms of the reliability of some of the content that ChatGPT, for example, puts out, it's not always accurate.
Yeah.
But the danger is written in a very convincing way that some people can't even tell whether it's accurate or not because it just sounds so good. But we're looking at some projects as to how that might be deployed. The bigger threat, I think, and something that everybody has been talking about, is the ability or risk of AI and LLMs being used to generate fake news, disinformation in ways that are very, very sophisticated. They can mimic the writing style and the tone and the voice of credible people, but they can do it at such speed and in such volumes that you might end up with a society where people, they may not necessarily believe everything that they see, but they get so confused that they don't know where to seek out good information anymore, because a ChatGPT article would sound like something that you read in the Washington Post or the New York Times or you see on the BBC, and gets to the point where, and there are video and image generation tools as well that anybody can just use to generate fake images. And when you combine all these things together, I think we're going to see much more confused landscapes and populations. So I think, again, it's a question of educating people to be very wary that this is a potential threat, or maybe not even potential, might even be here now. And then start to prime themselves of again having that emotional skepticism where I don't believe everything I see straight away, and I most importantly don't just share it to all my networks. I think that's a very important first step for us to take.
Well, Nicholas, we clearly have a lot of work cut out for us. Thank you so much for joining us here in Riga.
Really enjoyed the conversation, and hopefully we can keep working together as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.